Chapter 24 of Flemington by Violet Jacob. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elin. Chapter 24. The Vanity of Men. The last months had been a time of great anxiety to Lord Balnillo. In spite of his fine steering, and though he had escaped from molestation, he was not comfortable, as he saw the imprisonments and confiscations that were going on, and the precariousness of all that had been secure disturbed him and made him restless. He was unsettled, too, by his long stay in Edinburgh, and he hankered afresh after the town life in which he had spent so many of his years. His trees and parks interested him still, but he looked on them, wondering how long he would be allowed to keep them. He was lonely, and he missed James, whom he had not seen since long before Culloden, the star of whose destiny had led him out again into the world of chance. He had the most upsetting scheme under consideration that a man of his age can entertain. At 64, it is few people who think seriously of changing their state, yet this was what David Balnillo had in mind, for he had found so many good reasons for offering his hand to Christian Flemington that he had decided at last to take that portentous step. The greatest of these was the effect that an alliance with the Whig lady would produce in the quarters from which he feared trouble. His estate would be pretty safe if Madame Flemington reigned over it. It was pleasant to picture her magnificent presence at his table. Her company would rid country life of its dullness, and on the visits to Edinburgh, which he was sure she would wish to make, the new Lady Balnillo would turn their lodging into a bright spot in society. He smoothed his silk stockings as he imagined the stir that his belated romance would make. He would be the hero of it, and its heroine, besides being a safeguard to his property, would be a credit to himself. There were some obstacles to his plan, and one of them was Archie, but he believed that, with a little diplomacy, that particular difficulty might be overcome. He would attack that side of the business in a very straightforward manner. He would make Madame Flemington understand that he was large-minded enough to look upon the episode in which he had borne the part of victim in a reasonable yet airy spirit. In the game in which their political differences had brought them face to face, the honours had been with the young man. He would admit to that with a smile, and with the respect that one noble enemy accords to another. He would assure her that bygones should be bygones, and that when he claimed Archie as his grandson-in-law, he would do so without one grudging backward glance at the circumstances in which they had first met. His magnanimity seemed to him an almost touching thing, and he played with the idea of his own apposite grace when, in some sly but genial moment, he would suggest that the portrait upstairs should be finished. What had given the final touch to his determination was a message that James had contrived to send him, which removed the last scruple from his heart. His brother's danger had weighed upon David, and it was not only its convenience to himself at this juncture which made him receive it with relief. Logie was leaving the country for Holland, and the next tidings of him would come from there, should he be lucky enough to reach its shores alive. Since the rescue of Gourlay, the neighbourhood of the Muir of Pert, the last of his haunts in which Logie could trust himself, had become impossible for him, and he was now striving to get to a creek on the coast below Peterhead. It was some time since a roof had been over him, and the little cottage from which Flemington had dispatched his urgent warning stood empty. Its inmate had been his unsuspected connection with the world since his time of wandering had begun, for though his fatal mistake in discovering this link in his chain of communication to Flemington had made him abjure its shelter, he had had no choice for some time between the Muir and any other place. The western end of the county swarmed with troops. Montrose was subdued. The passes of the Grampians were watched. There remained only this barren tract west of the river, and the warning brought to him from a nameless source had implored him to abandon it before the soldiery, which his informant assured him was collecting to sweep it from end to end, should range itself on its borders. Archie had withheld his name when he sent the dweller in the little hovel speeding into the night. He was certain that in making it known to James he would defeat his own ends, for Logie would scarcely be disposed to trust his good faith, and might well look on the message as a trick to drive him into some trap waiting for him between the Muir and the sea. James did not give his brother any details of his projected flight. He merely bade him an indefinite goodbye. The game was up. Even he was obliged to admit that. And Ferrier, whose ardent spirit had been one with his own since the beginning of all things, was already making for a fishing village, from which he hoped to be smuggled out upon the high seas. Nothing further could be gained in Angus for the Stuart cause. The friends had spent themselves since April in their endeavours to resuscitate the feeling in the country, but there was no more money to be raised, no more men to be collected. They told themselves that all they could do now was to wait in the hope of a day when their services might be needed again. That day would find them both ready, if they were above ground. David knew that, had James been in Scotland, he would not have dared to think of bringing Christian Flemington to Balnillo. He had a feeling of adventure when he started from his own door for Ardguys. The slight awe with which Christian still inspired him, even when she was most gracious, was beginning to foreshadow itself, and he knew that his bones would be mighty stiff on the morrow. There was no riding of the circuit now to keep him in practice in the saddle. But he was not going to give way to silly apprehensions, unsuited to his age and position. He would give himself every chance in the way of effect. The servant who rode after him carried a handsome riding suit for his master to don at Forfar before making the last stage of his road. It grieved Balnillo to think how much of the elegance of his well-turned legs must be unrevealed by his high boots. He was a personable old gentleman, and his grey cob was worthy of carrying an eligible wooer. He reached Ardguys and dismounted under its walls on the following afternoon. He had sent no word in front of him. Christian rose when he was ushered into her presence, and laid down the book in her hand, surprised. "You are as unexpected as an earthquake," she exclaimed, as she saw who was her visitor. "But not as unwelcome," said David. "Far from it. Sit down, my lord. I'd begun to forget that civilization existed, and now I am reminded of it." He bowed, delighted. A few messages and compliments, a letter or two dispatched by hand, had been their only communication since the judge left Edinburgh, and his spirits rose as he found that she seemed really pleased to see him. "And what has brought you?" asked Christian, settling herself with the luxurious deliberation of a cat into the large chair from which she had risen. "Something good, certainly." "The simple desire to see you, ma'am. Could anything be better?" It was an excellent opening, but he had never, even in his youth, been a man who ran full tilt upon anything. He had scarcely ever before made so direct a speech. She smiled, amused. There had been plenty of time for thought in her solitude, but, though she had thought a great deal about him, she had not a suspicion of his errand. She saw people purely in relation to the uses she had for them, and officially she had pronounced him harmless to the party in whose interests she had kept him at her side. The circumstances were not those which further sentiment. "I have spent this quiet time in remembering your kindnesses to me," he began, inspired by her smile. "Oh, you call it a quiet time," she interrupted. "I had not looked on it in that way. Quiet for us, perhaps, but not for the country." True, true," said he, in the far-away tone in which some people seek to let unprofitable subjects melt. Now that the active part of the rebellion had become history, she had no hesitation in speaking out from her solid place on the winning side. "This wretched struggle is over, and we may be plain with one another, Lord Balnillo," she continued. "You, at least, have had much to alarm you." "I've been a peaceful servant of law and order all my life," said he, "and as such, I've conceived it my place to stand aloof. It has been my duty to restrain violence of all kinds." "But you have not restrained your belongings," she observed boldly. He was so much taken aback that he said nothing. "Well, my lord, it is one of my regrets that I have never seen Captain Logie. At least you have to be proud of a gallant man," she went on, with the same impulse that makes all humanity set a fallen child upon its legs. But Balnillo had a genius for scrambling to his feet. "My brother has left the country in safety," he rejoined, with one of those random flashes of sharpness that had stood him in such good stead. His cunning was his guardian angel, for he did not know what she knew, namely, that Archie had left Fort Augustus in pursuit of James. Indeed, she said, silenced. She was terribly disappointed, but she hid her feelings in barefaced composure. The judge drew his chair closer. Here was another opening, and his very nervousness pushed him towards it. "Ma'am," he began, clearing his throat, "I shall not despair of presenting James to you, when the country is settled. If, in short. I imagine that Captain Logie will hardly trust himself in Scotland, either in my lifetime or in yours. We are old, you and I," she added, the bitterness of her disappointment surging through her words. She watched him to see whether this barbed truth pierced him. It pierced herself as she hurled it. "Maybe," said he, "but age has not kept me from the business I have come upon. I've come to put a very particular matter before you." She was still unsuspicious, but she grew impatient. He had wearied her often in Edinburgh with tedious histories of himself, and she had endured them then for reasons of policy, but she felt no need of doing so here. It was borne in upon her, as it has been borne in upon many of us, that a person who is acceptable in town may be unendurable in the country. She had not thought of that as she welcomed him. "Ma'am," he went on, intent on nothing but his affair, "I may surprise you. I trust I shall not offend you. At least you will approve the feelings of devotion, of respect, of admiration which have brought me here. I have an ancient name. I have sufficient means. I'm not ill-looking, I believe." "Are you making me a proposal, my lord?" She spoke with an accent of derision. The sting of it was sharp in her tone. "There's no place for ridicule, ma'am. I see nothing unsuitable in my great regard for you." He spoke with real dignity. She had not suspected him of having any, personally, and she had forgotten that an inherited stock of it was behind him. The rebuke astonished her so much that she scarcely knew what reply to make. "As I said, I believe I'm not ill-looking," he repeated, with an air that lost him his advantage. "I can offer you such a position as you have a right to expect." "You also offer me a brother-in-law whose destination may be the scaffold," she said brutally. "Do not forget that." This was not to be denied, and for a moment he was put out. But it was on these occasions that he shone. "Let us dismiss family matters from our minds and think only of ourselves," said he. "My brother is an outlaw, and as such is unacceptable to you, and your grandson has every reason to be ashamed to meet me. We can set these disadvantages, one against the other, and agree to ignore them." "I'm not disposed to ignore Archie," said she. "Well, ma'am, neither am I. I hope I am a large-minded man. Indeed, no one can sit on the bench for the time that I've sat on it, and not realize the frailty of all creatures." "My lord," began Christian. But it is something to have learned continuance of speech professionally, and Balnillo was launched. Also, his own magnanimous attitude had taken his fancy. "I will remember nothing against him," said he. "I will forget his treatment of my hospitality, and the discreditable uses to which he put my roof." "Sir," broke in Christian, "I will remember that, according to his lights, he was in the exercise of his duty. Whatsoever may be my opinion of the profession to which he was compelled, I will thrust it behind me, with the things best forgotten." "That is enough, Lord Balnillo," cried Madame Flemington, rising. "Oh, sit, madam, sit. Do not disturb yourself. Understand me, that I will allow every leniency. I will make every excuse. I will dwell, not on the fact that he was a spy, but on his enviable relationship to yourself." She stood in the middle of the room, threatening him with her eyes. Some people tremble when roused to the pitch of anger that she had reached. Some gesticulate. Christian was still. He had risen, too. "If you suppose that I could connect myself with a disloyal house, you are much mistaken," she said, controlling herself with an effort. "I've no quarrel with your name, Lord Balnillo. It is old enough. My quarrel is with the treason in which it has been dipped. But I'm very well content with my own. Since I've borne it, I've kept it clean from any taint of rebellion." "But I've been a peaceful man," he protested. "As I told you, the law has been my profession. I've raised a hand against no one." "Do you think I do not know you?" exclaimed she. Do you suppose that my ears were shut in the winter, and that I heard nothing in all the months I spent in Edinburgh? What of that, Lord Balnillo? You made no objection to me then, ma'am. I was made happy by being of service to you. She laughed scornfully. Oh, let us be done with this, she said. You have offered yourself to me, and I refuse the offer. I will add my thanks. The last words were a masterpiece of insolent civility. A gilt-framed glass hung on the wall, one of the possessions that she had brought with her from France. David suddenly caught sight of his own head reflected in it, above the lace cravat for which he had paid so much. The spectacle gathered up his recollections and his present mortification, and fused them into one stab of hurt vanity. I see that you can make no further use of me, he said. None. He walked out of the room. At the door he turned and bowed. If you will allow me, I will call for my horse myself, said he. He went out of the house, and she stood where she was, thinking of what he had told her about his brother. She had set her heart upon Archie's success in taking Logie, and now the man had left the country, and his chance was gone. The proposal to which she had just listened did not matter to her, one way or the other, though he had offended her by the attitude he took up when making it. He was unimportant. It was of Archie that she thought, as she watched the judge and his servant ride away between the ash trees. They were crossing the Kilpie burn when her maid came in, bringing a letter. The writing on it was strange to Christian. "Who has brought this?" she asked, as she opened it. "Just a callant," replied the girl. She read the letter, which was short. It was signed R. Callender, Captain, and was written at Archie Flemington's request, to tell her that he was under arrest at Brechin on a charge of conspiring with the king's enemies. The writer added a sentence, unknown, as he explained, to Flemington. "The matter is serious," he wrote. "The Duke of Cumberland is still in Edinburgh. It might be well if you could see him. Make no delay, as we await his orders." She stood, turning cold, her eyes fixed on the maid. "Hey, losh, ma'am," whispered Mysie, approaching her with her hands raised. Madame Flemington felt as though her brain refused to work. There seemed to be nothing to drive it forward. The world stood still. The walls, an imprisoning horror, shut her in from all movement, all action, when action was needed. She had never felt Ardguys to be so desperately far from the reach of humanity, herself so much cut off from it, as now. And yet she must act. Her nearest channel of communication was the judge, riding away. "Fool," she cried, seizing Mysie. "Run, run. Send the boy after Lord Balnillo. Tell him to run." The maid hesitated, staring at the pallor of her mistress's face. But ma'am, sit you down," she wailed. Christian thrust her from her path as though she had been a piece of furniture, and swept into the hall. A barefooted youth was outside by the door. He stared at her, as Mysie had done. She took him by the shoulder. "Run. Go instantly after those horses. That is Lord Balnillo," she cried, pointing to the riders, who were mounting the rise beyond the burn. "Tell him to return at once. Tell him he must come back." He shook off her grip and ran. He was a corner boy from Brechin, and he had a taste for sensation. Madame Flemington went back into her room. Mysie followed her, whimpering still, and she pushed her outside and sank down in her large chair. She could not watch the window, for fear of going mad. She sat still and steady until she heard the thud of bare feet on the stone steps, and then she hurried out. "He told me he would not bide," said the corner boy breathlessly. "He was very well obliged to you, he bade me say, but he would not bide." Christian left him and shut herself into the room, alone. Callender's bald lines had overpowered her completely, leaving no place in her brain for anything else. But now she saw her message from Lord Balnillo's point of view, and anger and contempt flamed up again, even in the midst of her trouble. "The vanity of men! Oh God, the vanity of men!" she cried, throwing out her hands, as though to put the whole race of them from her. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Flemington by Violet Jacob. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elin. Chapter 25. A Royal Duke. The Duke of Cumberland was at Holyrood House. He had come down from the north by way of Stirling, and having spent some days in Edinburgh, he was making his final arrangements to set out for England. He was returning in the enviable character of conquering hero, and he knew that a great reception awaited him in London, where every preparation was being made to do him honour. He was thinking of these things as he sat in one of the grim rooms of the ancient palace. There was not much luxury here, and looking across the table at which he sat and out of the window, he could see the dirty roofs of the Canongate, a very different prospect from the one that would soon meet his eyes. He was sick of Scotland. Papers were littered on the table, and his secretary had just carried away a bundle with him. He was alone, because he expected a lady to whom he had promised an audience, but he was not awaiting her with the feelings that he generally brought to such occasions. Cumberland had received the visits of many women alone since leaving England, but his guests were younger than the one whose approach he could now hear in the anteroom outside. He drew his brows together, for he expected no profit, and some annoyance, from the interview. He rose as she was ushered in and went to the open fireplace, where he stood awaiting her, drawn up to his full height, which was not great. The huge iron dogs behind him and the high mantelpiece above his head dwarfed him with their large lines. He was not an ill-looking young man, though his hair, pulled back and tied after the fashion of the day, showed off the receding contours that fell away from his temples and made his blue eyes look more prominent than they were. He moved forward clumsily as Christian curtsied. "Come in, madam, come in. Be seated. I've a few minutes only to give you," he said, pointing to a chair on the farther side of the table. She sat down opposite to him. "I had the honour of being presented to your Royal Highness last year," she said. "I remember you well, madam," replied he shortly. "It is in the hope of being remembered that I've come," said she. "It is to ask you, sir, to remember the services of my house to yours." "I remember them, ma'am. I forget nothing." "I am asking you, in remembering, to forget one thing," said she. "I shall not waste your Royal Highness's time and mine in beating about bushes. I've travelled here from my house without resting, and it is not for me to delay now." He took up a pen that lay beside him and put the quill between his teeth. "Your Royal Highness knows why I have come," continued she, her eyes falling from his own and fixing themselves on the pen in his mouth. He removed it with his fat hand and tossed it aside. "There's absolute proof against Flemington," said he. "He accuses himself. I presume you know that." "I do. This man, Captain Logie, has some strange attraction for him that I cannot understand, and did him some kindness that seems to have turned his head. His regard for him was a purely personal one. It was personal friendship that led him to the madness he has wrought. His hands are clean of conspiracy. I've come all this way to assure your Highness of that." "It is possible," said Cumberland. "The result is the same. We have lost a man whose existence above ground is a danger to the kingdom." "I've come to ask you to take that difference of motive into consideration," she went on. "Were the faintest shadow of conspiracy proved, I should not dare to approach you. My request should not pass my lips. I've been in correspondence with him during the whole of the campaign, and I know that he served the king loyally. I beg your Highness to remember that now. I speak of his motive because I know it." "You are fortunate, then," he interrupted. "Captain Callender, to whom he gave himself up, wrote me 2 letters at his request, one in which he announced his arrest, and one which I received as I entered my coach to leave my door. Archie knows what is before him,' she added. He has no hope of life, and no knowledge of my action in coming to your Highness. But he wished me to know the truth, that he had conspired with no one. He is ready to suffer for what he has done, but he will not have me ashamed of him. Look, sir. She pushed the letter over to him. His motives may go hang, madam, said Cumberland. Your Highness, if you have any regard for us who have served you, read this. He rose and went back to the fireplace. There's no need, madam. I'm not interested in the correspondence of others. He was becoming impatient. He had spent enough time on this lady. She was not young enough to give him any desire to detain her. She was an uncommon-looking woman, certainly, but at her age that fact could matter to nobody. He wondered, casually, whether the old stories about her and Charles Edwards, his father, were true. Women struck him in only one light. You will not read this, Your Royal Highness, said Christian, with a little tremor of voice. No, ma'am. I may tell you that my decision has not altered. The case is not one that admits of any question. Your Highness, said Christian, rising, I've never made an abject appeal to anyone yet, and even now, though I make it to the son of my king, I can hardly bring myself to utter it. I deplore my boy's action from the bottom of my soul. I sent him from me. I parted from him nearly a year ago because of this man Logie. He faced round upon her and put his hands behind his back. What? He exclaimed. You knew of this? You have been keeping this affair secret between you. He went to Montrose on the track of Logie in November, said she. He was sent there to watch his movements before Prince Charles marched to England, and he did so well that he contrived to settle himself under Lord Balnillo's roof. In 3 days he returned to me. He had reported on Logie's movements. I know that. Your Highness's agents can produce his report. But he returned to my house to tell me that, for some fool reason, some private question of sentiment, he would follow Logie no longer. I will not go man-hunting after Logie. Those were his words. Madam, began Cumberland. She put out her hand, and her gesture seemed to reverse their positions. I told him to go. I told him that I would sooner see him dead than that he should side with the Stuarts. He answered me that he could have no part with rebels, and that his act concerned Logie alone. And then he left me, and on his way to Brechin he received orders to go to the government ship in Montrose harbour. And then the ship was attacked and taken. It was Flemington's friend, Logie, who was at the bottom of that business, said Cumberland. He met Logie, and they fought, said Madame Flemington. I know none of the details, but I know that they fought. Then he went to Edinburgh. It is time that we finished with this, exclaimed Cumberland. No good is served by it. I am near the end, Your Highness, said Christian, and then paused, unnerved by the too great suggestiveness of her words. These things are no concern of mine, he observed in the pause. His movements do not matter. And I may tell you, ma'am, that my leisure is not unlimited. It was nearing the close of the afternoon, and the sun stood like a red ball over the mists of the Edinburgh smoke. Cumberland's business was over for the day, and he was looking forward to dining that evening with a carefully chosen handful of friends, male and female. Her nerve was giving way against the stubborn detachment of the man. She felt herself helpless and her force ineffective. Life was breaking up round her. The last man she had confronted had spurned her in the end. Through a mistake, it was true, but the opportunity had been given him by her own loss of grip in the bewilderment of a crisis. This one was spurning her too. But she went on. He performed his work faithfully from that day forward, as your Royal Highness knew when you took him to the north. His services are better known to you, sir, than to anyone else. He gave himself up to Captain Callender as the last proof that he could take no part with the rebels. He threw away his life. Oh, that, at least, is true, said the Duke, with a sneer. He was becoming exasperated, and the emphasis which he put on the word "that" brought the slow blood to her face. She looked at him as though she saw him across some mud-befouled stream. Even now, her pride rose above the despair in her heart. He was not sensitive, but her expression stung him. "I am accustomed to truth," she replied. He turned his back. There was a silence. "I came to ask for Archie's life," she said, in a toneless, steady voice. "But I will go, asking nothing. Your Royal Highness has nothing to give that he or I would stoop to take at your hands." He stood doggedly, without turning, and he did not move until the sound of her sweeping skirts had died away in the ante-room. A short, stoutish figure passing along the dusty corridors of Holyrood, and entered a room from which came the ring of men's voices. A party of officers in uniform got up as he came in. Some were playing cards. He went up to one of the players and took those he held from between his fingers. "Give me your hand, Walden," said he, "and for God's sake, get us a bottle of wine. Damn me, but I hate old women. They should have their tongues cut out." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Flemington by Violet Jacob. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elin. Chapter 26. The Vanishing Bird. The houses of Brechin climb from the river up the slope, and a little camp was spread upon the crest of ground above them, looking down over the uneven pattern of walls, the rising smoke, and the woods that cradled the Esk. Such of Cumberland's soldiery as had collected in Angus was drawn together here, and as the country was settling down, the camp was increased by detachments of horse and foot that arrived daily from various directions. The muir of Pert was bare, left to the company of the roe deer and the birds, for James had been traced to the coast, and the hungry North Sea had swallowed his tracks. The spot occupied by the tents of Callender's troop was in the highest corner of the camp, the one farthest from the town, and the long northern light that lingered over the hill enveloped the camp sounds and sights in a still, greenish clearness. There would be a bare few hours of darkness. Callender was now in command of a small force consisting of a troop of his own regiment which had lately marched in, and 2 of his men stood sentry outside the tent, in which Archie Flemington was sitting at an improvised table, writing a letter. He had been a close prisoner since his arrest on the muir of Pert, and during the week that had elapsed, whilst correspondence about him, and orders concerning him, had gone to and fro between Brechin and Edinburgh, he had been exclusively under Callender's charge. That arrangement was the one concession made on his behalf among the many that had been asked for by his friends. At his own request, he was to remain Callender's prisoner till the end, and it was to be Callender's voice that would give the order for his release at sunrise tomorrow, and Callender's troopers whose hands would set him free. The 2 men had spent much time together. Though the officer's responsibility did not include the necessity of seeing much of his prisoner, he had chosen to spend nearly all his leisure in Archie's tent. They had drawn very near together, this incongruous pair, though the chasm that lay between their respective temperaments had not been bridged by words. They had sat together on many evenings, almost in silence, playing cards until one of them grew drowsy, or some officious cock crowed on the outskirts of the town. Of the incident which had brought them into their present relationship, they spoke not at all. But sometimes Archie had broken out into snatches of talk, and Callender had listened, with his grim smile playing about his mouth, to his descriptions of the men and things amongst which his short life had thrown him. As he looked across at his companion, who sat, his eyes sparkling in the light of the lantern, his expression changing with the shades of humour that ran over his words, like shadows over growing corn, he would be brought up short against the thought of the terrible incongruity to come, and death. He could not think of Archie and death. At times he would have given a great deal to pass on his responsibility to some other man, and to turn his back on the place that was to witness such a tragedy. In furthering Archie's wishes by his application for custody of him, he had given him a great proof of friendship. How great, he was only to learn as the days went by. Would to God that it were over! So he would say to himself each night as he left the tent. He had thought Archie soft when they parted at the crossroads, and he had been sorry. There was no need for sorrow on that score, never had been. The sorrow to him now was that so gallant, so brilliant a creature was to be cut off from the life of the world, to go down into the darkness, leaving so many of its inhabitants half-hearted, half-spirited, half alive, to crawl on in an existence which only interested them, inasmuch as it supplied their common needs. His hostility against Logie ran above the level of the just antagonism that a man feels for his country's enemy, and he questioned whether his life were worth the price that Flemington was paying for it. The hurried words that Archie had spoken about Logie as they left the hovel together had told him little, and that little seemed to him inadequate to explain the tremendous consequences that had followed. What had Logie said or done that had power to turn him out of his way? A man may meet many admirable characters among his enemies without having his efforts paralyzed by the encounter. Flemington was not new to his trade, and had been long enough in the Secret Service to know its requirements. A certain unscrupulousness was necessarily among them, yet why had his gorge only risen against it now? Calendar could find no signs in him of the overwrought sensibility that seemed to have prompted his revolt against his task. Logie had placed his safety in Archie's hands, and it was in order to end that safety that the young man had gone out. He had laid the trap, and the quarry had fallen into it. What else had he expected? It was not that Calendar could not understand the scruple. What he could not understand was why a man of Archie's occupation should suddenly be undone by it. Having accepted his task, his duty had been plain. In theory, a rebel, the Calendar was a rebel, no more, and Archie, by his deed, had played a rebel's part. Yet, in spite of that, the duty he must carry out on the morrow was making his heart sink within him. One thing about Archie stood out plain. He was not going to shirk his duty to his king and yet take government money. Whatsoever his doings, the prisoner who sat in the tent over yonder would be lying under the earth tomorrow, because he was prepared to pay the last price for his scruple. No, he was not soft. Calendar would have died sooner than let him escape, yet his escape would have made him glad. Calendar came across the camp and passed between the two sentries into Flemington's tent. The young man looked up from his writing. "You are busy," said the officer. "I've nearly done. There seems so much to do at the last," he added. The other sat down on the bed and looked at him, filled with grief. The lantern stood by Archie's hand. His head was bent into the circle of light, and the yellow shine that fell upon it warmed his olive skin and brought out the brown shades in his brows and hair. The changing curves of his mouth were firm in the intensity of his occupation. He had so much expression, as a rule, that people seldom thought about his features, but Calendar now noticed his long chin and the fine lines of his nostril. His pen scratched on for a few minutes, then he laid it down and turned round. "You have done me many kindnesses, Calendar," said he, "and now I am going to ask you for another, the greatest of all. It is everything to me that Captain Logie should get this letter. He's safe, I hope, over the water, but I do not know where. Will you take charge of it?" "I will," said the other. "Yes." The very name of Logie went against him. "You will have to keep it some little time, I fear," continued Archie, "but when the country has settled down you will be able to reach him through Lord Balnillo. Promise me that, if you can compass it, he shall get this." "If it is to be done, I will do it." "From you, that is enough," said Flemington. "I shall rest quietly." He turned to his writing again. Calendar sat still, looking round the tent vaguely for something to distract his heavy thoughts. A card lay on the ground, and he picked it up. It was an ace, and the blank space of white round it was covered with a drawing. His own consideration had procured pens and books, all that he could find to brighten the passing days for his prisoner. This was the result of some impulse that had taken Flemington's artistic fingers. It was a sketch of one of the sentries outside the tent door. The figure was given in a few lines, dark against the light, and the outline of the man's homely features had gained some quality of suggestiveness and distinction by its passage through Archie's mind, and by the way he had placed the head against the clouded atmosphere made by the smoke rising from the camp. Through it came a touched-in vision of the horizon beyond the tents. He looked at it, seeing something of its cleverness, and tossed it aside. When Archie had ended his letter, he read it through. "When this comes to your hands, perhaps you will know what has become of me," he had written, "and you will understand the truth. I ask you to believe me, if only because these are the last words I shall ever write. A man speaks the truth when it is a matter of hours with him. You know what brought me to Balnillo, but you do not know what sent me from it. I went because I had no courage to stay. I was sent to find out how deep you were concerned in the Stuart cause and to watch your doings. I followed you that night in the town, and my wrist bears the mark you set on it still. That morning I dispatched my confirmation of the government's suspicions about you. And then I met you, and we sat by the basin of Montrose. God knows I've never forgotten the story you told me. Logie, I went because I could not strike you again. You had been struck too hard in the past, and I could not do it. What I told you about myself was untrue, but you believed it, and would have helped me. How could I go on? And then, as I stood between the devil and the deep sea, my orders took me to the Venture, and we met again on Inchbrayock. I had made sure you would be on the hill. When I would have escaped from you, you held me back, and as we struggled, you knew me for what I was. You know the rest as well as I do, and you know where I was in the campaign that followed. Last of all, I was sent out with those who were to take you on the Muir of Pert. I had no chance but to go. The choice came at the crossroads below Huntley Hill. It was I who sent the warning to you from the little house on the Muir. You had directed me there for a different purpose. I sent no name with my message, knowing that if I did, you might suspect me of a trick to entrap you again. That is all. There remained only the consequences, and I shall be face to face with them tomorrow. There's one thing more to say. Do not let yourself suppose that I am paying for your life with mine. I might have escaped had I tried to do so. It was my fault that I did not try. I'd had enough of untruth, and I could no longer take the king's money. I'd served his cause ill, and I could only pay for it. I've known 2 true men in my life, you and the man who has promised that you shall receive this letter. If you will think of me without bitterness, remember that I should have been glad. Archibald Flemington. He folded the paper and rose, holding it out to Calendar. I'm contented, said he. Go now, Calendar. You look worn out. I believe this last night is trying you more than it tries me. It was some little time after daybreak that Calendar stood again at the door of the tent under the kindling skies. Archie was waiting for him, and he came out. The eyes of the sentries never left them as they went away together, followed by the small armed guard that was at Calendar's heels. The two walked a little apart, and when they reached the outskirts of the camp they came to a field, an insignificant rough enclosure, in which 6 soldiers were gathered, waiting. At the sight of Calendar, the sergeant who was in charge of them began to form them in a line some paces from the wall. Calendar and Flemington stopped. The light had grown clear, and the smoke that was beginning to rise from the town thickened the air over the roofs that could be seen from where they stood. The daily needs and the daily avocations were beginning again for those below the hill, while they were ceasing forever for him who stood above in the cool morning. In a few minutes the sun would get up. Already there was a sign of his coming in the eastward sky. The two men turned to each other. They had nothing more to say. They had settled every detail of this last act of their short companionship, so that there should be no hesitation, no mistake, nothing to be a lengthening of agony for one, nor an evil memory for the other. Archie held out his hand. "When I look at you," he said. "Yes," said Calendar. "There are no words, Calendar. Words are nothing. But the last bit of my life has been the better for you." For once, speech came quickly to the soldier. "The rest of mine will be the better for you," he answered. "You said once that you were not a true man. You lied." Flemington was giving all to disprove the accusation of untruth, and it was one of the last things he was to hear. So, with these rough words, more precious to him than any that could have been spoken, sounding in his ears, he walked away and stood before the wall. The men were lined in front of him. His eyes roved for a moment over the slope of the country, the town roofs, the camp, then went to the distance. A solitary bird was crossing the sky, and his look followed it, as it had followed the one he had seen when he made his choice at the foot of Huntley Hill. The first had flown away, a vanishing speck, towards the shadows gathering about the hills. This one was going into the sunrise. It was lost in the light. "Fire," said Calendar. For Archie was looking at him with a smile. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Flemington by Violet Jacob. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elin. Chapter 27. Epilogue. James Logie stood at the window of a house in a Dutch town. The pollarded beech, whose boughs were trimmed in a close screen before the walls, had shed its golden leaves, and the canal waters were grey under a cloudy sky. The long room was rather dark, and was growing darker. By the chair that he had left lay a yellow cur. He had been standing for some minutes reading a letter by the fading light, and his back was towards the man who had brought it. The latter stood watching him, stiff and tall, an object of suspicion to the dog. As he came to the end, the hand that held the paper went down to James's side. The silence in the room was unbroken for a space. When he turned, Calendar saw his powerful shoulders against the dusk and the jealous shadows of the beech tree's mutilated arms. "I can never thank you enough for bringing me this," said Logie. "My debt to you is immeasurable." "I did it for him, not for you." Calendar spoke coldly, almost with antagonism. "I can understand that," said James. But something in his voice struck the other. Though he had moved as if to leave him, he stopped, and, going over to the window, drew a playing card from a pocket in his long coat. "Look," he said, holding out the ace scrawled with a picture of the sentry. James took it, and as he looked at it, his crooked lip was set stiffly, lest it should tremble. "It was in his tent when I went back there. Afterwards," said Calendar. He took the card back and put it in his pocket. "Then it was you," began James. "He was my prisoner, sir." James walked away again and stood at the window. Calendar waited, silent. "I must wish you a good day, Captain Logie," he said at last. "I have to leave Holland tonight." James followed him down the staircase, and they parted at the outer door. Calendar went away along the street, and James came back slowly up the steep stairs, his hand on the railing of the carved banisters, He could scarcely see his way. The yellow dog came to meet him when he entered his room, and as his master, still holding the letter, carried it again to the light, he followed. Halfway across the floor, he stopped to sniff at an old Kilmarnock bonnet that lay by the wainscot near the corner in which he slept. He put his nose against it, and then looked at Logie. Trust was in his eyes, and affection, but there was inquiry, too. "Oh, my poor lad," said James. "We both remember." End of chapter 27. Recording by Elin. End of Flemington by Violet Jacob.